For decades, tales of elusive ape-like creatures have haunted the edges of civilization. Dense forests, remote mountains, and forgotten trails. Witnesses describe towering figures with unnatural strength and intelligence, often watching silently from the shadows. But sometimes the creature doesn't just watch, it strikes. From cabins torn apart in the snowy mountains of Poland to shredded tents deep in Thailand's jungle, these are chilling encounters authorities couldn't explain, and some didn't even investigate. In this video, we uncover 6 terrifying cases where Bigfoot didn't just appear, it attacked. The Pine Mesa RV grounds sat nestled in a remote valley of the Ashmere Range Reserve, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and dense undergrowth that had remained largely untouched since the area's establishment as a campground in 1967. The facility attracted off-grid enthusiasts and nature lovers seeking solitude away from California's crowded coastal attractions. Trinity County had long been known for its wilderness encounters, with local rangers occasionally filing reports of unusual animal behavior and unexplained sounds echoing through the forest canopy. On the evening of May 23, 2025, 3 families had settled into their recreational vehicles for what they expected to be a peaceful weekend retreat. Jason Calloway, a 62-year-old retired contractor from Reno, Nevada, had parked his 30-foot Winnebago near the campground's eastern perimeter alongside his German Shepherd, Rufus. The Hendricks family from Sacramento occupied a travel trailer in the center of the grounds, while elderly couple Margaret and Harold Voss had positioned their compact RV closest to the forest edge. The trouble began shortly after midnight, when Jason was awakened by an overwhelming stench that seemed to seep through his RV's ventilation system. He later described the odor as a combination of rotting fish and wet animal fur, so potent it made his eyes water. Rufus began whimpering and pacing nervously around the small living space, his ears pinned back in a way Jason had never witnessed during their 8 years together. Heavy footsteps began circling the campground around 12:30 in the morning. Jason initially assumed another camper was taking a late-night walk, but the measured thuds seemed too deliberate and too heavy for a normal person. The steps would pause for several minutes at each RV, accompanied by what sounded like deep, rhythmic breathing just outside the thin aluminum walls. When Rufus suddenly bolted through the RV's screen door and began barking frantically into the darkness, Jason grabbed his high-powered flashlight and followed his dog outside. The German Shepherd's barking ceased abruptly after less than 30 seconds, replaced by an eerie silence that made Jason's skin crawl. He called for Rufus repeatedly, but received no response. Jason swept his flashlight beam across the tree line and caught a glimpse of something massive moving between the Douglas firs. Although visibility was poor, he claimed to see a towering silhouette, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders covered in thick, matted fur. The creature appeared to be cradling a limp form in its arms, presumably Rufus, though this detail could not be conclusively verified. Its movement was fluid and purposeful as it disappeared deeper into the forest. Moments after the creature vanished, a sudden electrical failure plunged the entire campground into darkness. Forensic technicians later determined that all 3 RVs experienced simultaneous battery drain and surge anomalies, consistent with high-voltage electromagnetic interference. Jason heard the Hendricks family screaming from their trailer as something began pounding against their RV's exterior walls with tremendous force. The metallic banging continued for nearly 10 minutes, accompanied by low, grunting sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions. Margaret Voss later reported seeing a pair of glowing eyes peering through her RV's window before something began rocking their vehicle back and forth so violently that dishes crashed from their cabinets. Harold attempted to start their engine and flee, but their RV's electrical system had also been disabled. By dawn, the attacks had ceased. The Hendricks family's trailer was discovered with a massive hole torn through its side wall, large enough for a person to walk through. Bloodstains covered the interior, but no bodies were found. Deep claw marks gouged the aluminum siding at a height of nearly 9 feet from the ground, far beyond the reach of any known bear species in the region. Trinity County Sheriff's Department investigators arrived that afternoon and conducted a thorough examination of the scene. They measured footprints in the soft earth that appeared human-like, but were 18 inches long and showed clear toe impressions. The stride length between prints measured over 6 feet, suggesting a creature of enormous proportions. Despite the physical evidence, official reports attributed the incident to an aggressive black bear searching for food. Sheriff spokesman Deputy Robert Chen explained that bears occasionally displayed unusual behavior when protecting territory or cubs. The missing Hendricks family was classified as persons of interest in an ongoing investigation, though no evidence suggested they had staged their own disappearance. Jason Calloway returned to Reno immediately after giving his statement to investigators. He sold his RV within a week and refused to discuss the incident with local media. When contacted months later, he would only say that whatever attacked the campground that night had demonstrated an intelligence and deliberate malice unlike any wild animal he had ever encountered. Rufus was never found, despite extensive search efforts by both authorities and Jason himself. The Pine Mesa RV grounds closed permanently 3 weeks after the incident, citing liability concerns and declining bookings. The Tatra Mountains along Poland's southern border had served as a natural barrier between civilizations for centuries, their jagged peaks and dense forests harboring wildlife that had largely disappeared from other European regions. The area surrounding Zakopane had been developed for tourism during the communist era, but many remote sections remained accessible only by foot trails that wound through ancient spruce and fir forests. Local folklore spoke of creatures that walked upright through these woods, stories that older residents shared in hushed tones during long winter evenings. In August 1991, shortly after Poland's political transformation, Zofia Bronska and her cousin Marek Kowalski decided to rent a secluded wooden cabin for a weekend hiking expedition. Both worked as teachers in Krakow and sought respite from the uncertainty surrounding their country's economic transition. The hut they selected sat 3 kilometers from the nearest marked trail, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that required nearly 2 hours of steady climbing to reach. The elderly proprietor in Zakopane, who rented them the cabin keys, warned them about strange howling sounds that echoed through the higher elevations during summer months. He insisted these calls came from wolves, though his weathered expression suggested he believed otherwise. Zofia and Marek dismissed his concerns as typical mountain superstition designed to add drama to their adventure. Their first day passed without incident as they explored nearby ridges and photographed the stunning alpine scenery. The cabin itself was spartanly furnished but comfortable, with thick log walls and a stone fireplace that provided adequate warmth against the mountain chill. They prepared a simple dinner and retired early, planning to attempt a summit climb the following morning. During their second night, both cousins were awakened around 2 in the morning by the sound of heavy footsteps circling their cabin. The steps moved deliberately and steadily, suggesting bipedal movement rather than the 4-legged gait of deer or wild boar that commonly inhabited the region. Marek quietly moved to the window, but could see nothing in the darkness beyond the tree line. The footsteps stopped directly outside their front door, followed by what sounded like deep, measured breathing. Thinking a lost hiker might require assistance, Marek called out in Polish, asking if someone needed help. The breathing ceased immediately, replaced by an unsettling silence that lasted several minutes. When scratching sounds began against the cabin's wooden door, Marek decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and slowly opened the heavy wooden barrier, expecting to find a confused tourist or perhaps an injured climber seeking shelter. Instead, he found himself face to face with a creature that stood nearly 8 feet tall, its massive frame covered in thick, dark brown fur. The being's face appeared more structured than that of an animal, with forward-facing eyes and a flat nose, but lacking clear human expression or familiarity. For several seconds, both man and creature stared at each other in mutual shock. The spell broke when the creature opened its mouth and released a roar that was loud and guttural, startling Marek and making the log walls creak, but not enough to physically shake the cabin. Zofia screamed from inside the cabin as Marek stumbled backward and slammed the door shut. The creature immediately began attacking the cabin's exterior, its powerful fists pounding against the wooden walls with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. Within minutes, the front door was torn completely from its hinges, the heavy wooden planks splintered like kindling. The creature's silhouette filled the doorway as it prepared to enter their refuge. Zofia and Marek escaped through the cabin's rear window, a narrow opening that barely accommodated their bodies. They ran through the dark forest for over 5 kilometers, stumbling over roots and rocks until they reached a ranger station near dawn. Both were scratched and exhausted, their clothing torn from their desperate flight through dense undergrowth. The mountain rangers who responded to their report found the cabin in shambles, with deep claw marks embedded in the wooden walls and enormous footprints surrounding the structure. The prints measured over 16 inches in length and showed clear toe impressions, though official reports classified the incident as a wolverine disturbance caused by food storage violations. Zofia never returned to mountain hiking and moved to the Baltic coast within a year, citing a preference for open spaces over enclosed forests. Marek continued teaching in Krakow but refused to discuss the incident with colleagues or family members, maintaining only that some encounters were better left unexplained. The Rangkong Valley Reserve in Arunachal Pradesh represented one of India's most isolated wilderness areas, its dense bamboo forests and steep mountain terrain serving as home to endangered species and indigenous communities that had maintained traditional lifestyles for generations. The region's remoteness had protected it from extensive development, though occasional researchers and forestry students were granted permits to study its unique ecosystem. Local tribal groups, particularly the Tangsa people, spoke of forest guardians that protected their ancestral lands from outsiders who showed disrespect to nature. In March 2008, 24-year-old forestry student Deepak Yadav arrived in the region to conduct field research for his master's thesis on bamboo species diversity. His project required several weeks of detailed documentation in areas rarely visited by scientists, making him dependent on local guides and traditional knowledge holders for navigation and safety. The Tangsa village that agreed to host him consisted of 23 bamboo huts connected by narrow paths that wound through the surrounding forest. Deepak's assigned guide was Prem Tangsa, a 30-year-old hunter who knew the forest's most remote sections and could identify plant species by their local names. Prem had initially seemed hesitant to venture into certain areas, explaining that some locations were considered sacred and should not be disturbed during specific seasons. He agreed to the expedition only after village elders granted their permission following traditional ceremonies. Their first 3 days proceeded smoothly as Deepak cataloged various bamboo species and collected samples for later analysis. The forest's biodiversity exceeded his expectations, with several plant varieties that appeared undocumented in existing scientific literature. He maintained detailed notes about each specimen's location and growing conditions, planning to recommend the area for expanded conservation protection. On their fourth night, the village's livestock began disappearing without explanation. 3 goats and 2 pigs vanished from their pens during the early morning hours, leaving behind only scattered bloodstains and damaged enclosures. The animals had been killed silently, with no sounds of struggle or distress calls that typically accompanied predator attacks. Village elders examined the kill sites and discovered massive footprints in the muddy ground around the animal pens. The prints appeared human-like, but measured over 15 inches in length, with clearly defined toe marks that suggested a bipedal creature of enormous size. The stride length between footprints indicated something much larger than any known primate species in the region. That same evening, torrential rains began falling as monsoon season arrived ahead of schedule. Deepak and Prem took shelter in their shared bamboo hut, listening to the steady drumming of water against the woven roof. Around midnight, both men heard a heavy rustling outside, followed by what sounded like deliberate movement past their shelter. Prem stepped outside to investigate, taking a flashlight with him and telling Deepak to remain inside. Deepak waited in the hut for nearly an hour before growing concerned about his guide's extended absence. When he finally ventured outside, he found no trace of Prem anywhere in the immediate vicinity. The bamboo wall adjacent to their sleeping area showed deep gouges that appeared to have been made by enormous claws. The scratches extended from ground level to nearly 8 feet high, suggesting whatever made them possessed incredible reach and strength. Fresh footprints in the rain-softened earth led away from the hut toward the densest section of bamboo forest. Deepak alerted the village immediately, and search parties began combing the surrounding area at first light. They followed the massive footprints for over 2 kilometers before the trail disappeared in rocky terrain near a steep ravine. Prem's torn shirt was discovered hanging from bamboo branches 30 feet above the forest floor, though no explanation could be provided for how it reached such a height. Village elders believed the incident was linked to an unknown forest animal with territorial behavior, one that might have perceived Prem's actions as a threat. Authorities from the state capital of Itanagar launched an official investigation after Deepak reported the disappearance. Forest Department officials examined the physical evidence, but concluded that a rogue leopard was responsible for both the livestock kills and Prem's disappearance. They noted that unusual weather patterns might have driven predators to more aggressive behavior than normal. Deepak's research journal, however, contained detailed observations about something that walked upright through the bamboo groves, left a pungent organic odor, and may have stalked their location repeatedly based on circumstantial signs. No evidence of vocal mimicry or supernatural behavior was recorded. The incident prompted Deepak to abandon his forestry studies within 6 months of returning to university. He changed his academic focus to urban planning and refused to discuss his experiences in Arunachal Pradesh with professors or fellow students, maintaining only that some research locations were too dangerous for scientific investigation. The Kenai Peninsula's wilderness areas had remained largely unchanged since Alaska achieved statehood in 1959, with vast stretches of untamed forest and countless rivers that provided some of North America's finest salmon fishing. The Ho'olitna River system wound through particularly remote terrain, accessible only by small aircraft or arduous overland travel that required several days of hiking through dense vegetation. Local indigenous communities had fished these waters for thousands of years, though their stories about the region's other inhabitants were often dismissed by outsiders as folklore. In July 1976, brothers Harold and Stephen Mackey traveled from their home in Anchorage to spend 2 weeks fishing for salmon during the peak summer run. Harold, 42, worked as a telecommunications technician, while his younger brother Stephen, 37, made his living as a commercial fisherman. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who had spent countless hours in Alaska's backcountry without incident. They transported their 16-foot aluminum boat to the Ho'olitna River via floatplane, planning to establish a base camp along the riverbank and fish different sections over the course of their stay. The pilot who dropped them off warned about recent bear activity in the area, advising them to secure their food supplies and maintain clean campsites to avoid unwanted visitors. Their first week produced excellent fishing results, with both brothers catching their limit of salmon on most days. They established their camp on a gravel bar beside a deep pool that held large numbers of fish, setting up their tent 50 yards from the water's edge, where they anchored their boat each evening. On their 8th night, both men were awakened around 3 a.m. by loud splashing sounds from the river. Stephen initially assumed a large salmon was jumping near their boat, though the splashing seemed more violent and sustained than typical fish activity. The sounds were followed by what Harold later described as metallic scraping and banging, as if something was manipulating their aluminum boat. Harold grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the riverbank to investigate, but the sound ceased as soon as he began moving. He swept his light beam across the water's surface, but saw nothing unusual. Their boat appeared to be properly secured to the anchor rope they had tied to a large boulder on shore. When daylight arrived, the brothers discovered their boat had completely disappeared. The anchor rope had been snapped, not cut, with the break showing evidence of tremendous force applied in a twisting motion. They began searching the immediate area and found their boat nearly 100 yards inland, dragged through dense forest and completely destroyed. The aluminum hull had been punctured in multiple locations, with holes that might have been made by enormous claws or teeth. The boat's motor had been torn from its mounting bracket and thrown another 30 yards deeper into the forest. The surrounding vegetation showed a clear path of disturbance, indicating something powerful had moved the boat through terrain that would normally be impassable. Harold discovered additional evidence while searching for salvageable equipment. Several large trees along the boat's path showed fresh claw marks extending from ground level to heights of 12 feet or more. The marks were too wide and too deep to have been made by bears, and their patterns suggested a creature with longer claws and greater strength than any known predator in the region. Although no one directly witnessed the culprit or the boat being moved, the physical evidence raised serious questions. Their campsite also showed signs of disturbance, with several packs overturned and a strong, foul odor lingering in the air. The brothers speculated about animal scent marking, but there was no forensic confirmation. Harold suffered a dislocated shoulder and multiple bruises while attempting to climb a tree to escape what he believed was still watching them from the forest. He insisted that something bipedal and massive had been observing their movements from behind the tree line, though Stephen was unable to confirm these sightings. The brothers were forced to hike out to the nearest settlement, a journey that required 3 days of difficult travel through unmarked terrain. Harold's injury made the trek particularly challenging, and both men arrived at the small community of Cooper Landing exhausted and dehydrated. Alaska Warden Robert Chen investigated their report and examined the destroyed boat site via helicopter. His official report attributed the incident to an unusually aggressive brown bear, though he privately acknowledged that the evidence was inconsistent with typical bear behavior patterns. The incident had lasting effects on both brothers. Stephen continued fishing in Alaska's remote areas and occasionally returned to the Kenai Peninsula, though he avoided the Ho'olitna River system entirely. Harold never participated in another wilderness camping trip and eventually moved to the lower 48 states, citing his inability to feel comfortable in Alaska's forests. Harold later wrote a memoir about his experiences in Alaska's outdoors, but his publisher removed the chapter describing the boat incident after expressing concerns about potential legal challenges from state tourism officials. He maintained until his death in 2003 that something intelligent and malevolent had deliberately terrorized them that night. displaying behavior that went far beyond simple animal aggression. Thanok Khun National Park in western Thailand's Kanchanaburi province had gained international recognition for its 7-tiered waterfall system and diverse ecosystem that supported over 200 bird species and numerous mammals, including Asian elephants and leopards. The park covered 550 square kilometers of pristine tropical forest along the Myanmar border, with elevations ranging from 200 to over 1,500 meters above sea level. Its established trail network attracted thousands of visitors annually, though its more remote sections remained largely unexplored by casual tourists due to difficult terrain and bureaucratic restrictions on off-trail activities. The region's history stretched back centuries, with Karen and Mon tribal communities establishing settlements along the park's rivers long before Thailand's modern boundaries were established. Local Karen tribe members who worked as park guides occasionally reported unusual encounters in the deepest jungle areas, stories that park administration typically attributed to cultural folklore rather than actual wildlife sightings. These accounts often described bipedal creatures that moved through the forest canopy with startling agility and behavior, suggesting complex awareness beyond that of known primates. In November 2016, American backpackers Jacob Langston and Elisa Moreno arrived in Thailand as part of a 6-month Southeast Asian adventure, funded by savings from their respective careers. Jacob, 26, worked as a software developer in Portland and had previously trekked through Nepal's Himalayas and Peru's Andes Mountains. Elisa, 24, had recently completed her graduate degree in environmental science from the University of Colorado and possessed extensive experience with wilderness survival techniques. After spending several days exploring Thanok Khun's main attractions and photographing the famous waterfall tiers, they decided to venture off the marked trail system to experience Thailand's jungle environment without the crowds of day tourists who typically departed by late afternoon. Park officials strongly discouraged off-trail camping, citing safety concerns about unstable weather patterns, protected wildlife habitat regulations, and the difficulty of conducting rescue operations in remote terrain. However, the couple had obtained the necessary permits through persistent negotiation with park administrators, demonstrating their wilderness experience and agreeing to carry emergency communication devices. Their planned route would take them through sections of forest that had been logged decades earlier, but had since returned to dense tropical vegetation that harbored species rarely observed by researchers. Their chosen campsite lay approximately 3 kilometers from the nearest marked trail, accessible only by following animal paths and stream beds through dense tropical vegetation that included towering dipterocarp trees and extensive bamboo thickets. The location offered a small clearing beside a seasonal creek that provided both water access and enough open space for their lightweight tent, while remaining concealed from aerial observation. Local Karen guides they had consulted in the nearby village of Ban Thung Na Dam warned them against camping in that particular area, explaining through translation that it was considered spiritually significant and potentially dangerous after dark. The guides described a territorial forest entity that protected the jungle from intruders who showed disrespect to the natural environment or disturbed sacred sites. According to tribal tradition, this being was associated with the dry season, when water sources became scarce and territorial disputes between animal species intensified. Village elders claimed that hunters had reportedly disappeared over the years after venturing too far from established paths during nighttime hours. Jacob and Elisa dismissed these warnings as typical tourist folklore, designed to encourage the use of paid guide services and discourage independent exploration that might reduce local employment opportunities. They established their campsite during late afternoon, carefully following leave no trace principles and storing their food supplies in bear-proof containers, despite the absence of bears in Thailand's ecosystem. As tropical darkness fell rapidly around 6 in the evening, the jungle's sounds seemed normal during their first few hours, with the typical chorus of insects, nightbirds, and occasional monkey calls echoing through the canopy. They prepared a simple meal using their portable camp stove and discussed their planned route for the following day, which would take them deeper into unexplored sections of the park. Around 10 that evening, the jungle fell completely silent, in a way that neither backpacker had experienced during their extensive travels through wilderness areas on multiple continents. The sudden absence of insect and animal sounds created an unsettling atmosphere that made both travelers uncomfortably aware of their isolation and vulnerability in such remote terrain. This unnatural quiet lasted for nearly 2 hours, during which no communication was recorded or transmitted from their location. When normal jungle sounds gradually resumed around midnight, it was later inferred through environmental evidence that something may have passed through the area. Elisa had mentioned in a prior entry to a park log that she sometimes felt uneasy at night due to hearing unexplained movement nearby, though Jacob had reportedly attributed this to small animals moving through the undergrowth. Park rangers discovered their abandoned campsite the following morning after Jacob's parents in Portland reported missing their scheduled satellite phone check-in call that the couple had promised to make every 48 hours. A search team led by Senior Ranger Somchai Thanakit found the couple's tent completely shredded, with long tiers that extended from the ground to a height of nearly 8 feet, far beyond the reach of most predatory animals. Their sleeping bags and personal belongings were scattered throughout the clearing in a pattern that suggested violent disturbance rather than methodical searching by human intruders. Valuable items, including their camera equipment and satellite communication device, remained untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive for the apparent attack. Forensic investigators from Bangkok's Central Investigation Bureau found a trail of human blood leading from the destroyed campsite into the jungle's interior, though no bodies were ever recovered despite extensive search operations involving over 50 personnel, including military units equipped with thermal imaging equipment and tracking dogs. The blood trail continued for approximately 200 meters before disappearing near a rocky outcropping where the terrain became too difficult for effective tracking. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood belonged to both missing individuals, though the quantity was insufficient to determine whether their injuries had been fatal. The campsite itself showed evidence of something extremely large having remained in the area for an extended period before the disturbance occurred. A depression in the soft ground near the tent suggested that something heavy had been crouching or sitting for hours, possibly observing the campers' activities. Soil analysis indicated the depression was created by an object weighing over 400 pounds, far exceeding the weight of any known predator species in the region. Hair samples collected from torn tent fabric proved inconclusive when analyzed by Thailand's Department of National Parks, Wildlife and Plant Conservation. The samples showed characteristics that did not match any known primate species in Southeast Asia, though officials maintained that contamination during collection might have affected the results and prevented accurate species identification. No photographic evidence was recovered from the scene. Park officials attributed the incident to a rogue Asian elephant, or possibly a large cat species, noting that both animals occasionally displayed aggressive behavior toward humans who encroached on their territory during mating seasons or periods of food scarcity. However, the physical evidence at the scene was inconsistent with elephant attack patterns, and no confirmed leopard sightings had been reported in that section of the park for over 3 years. Jacob's parents, Robert and Linda Langston, established a foundation dedicated to promoting backpacker safety and continue traveling to Thailand annually to conduct their own search efforts with the assistance of private investigators and local guides who knew the region's most remote areas. Blackwater Pines National Preserve occupied 40,000 acres of Oregon's Cascade Range. Its name derived from the dark reflection of ancient pine forests in the numerous small lakes scattered throughout the region. The preserve had been established in 1954, following devastating wildfires that destroyed much of the area's original timber during the exceptionally dry summer of 1951, leaving behind a landscape of regrowth forest interspersed with abandoned logging roads and the ruins of sawmill operations that had once employed hundreds of workers from nearby communities. The terrain's combination of dense second-growth vegetation and rugged topography made it an ideal habitat for wildlife that preferred minimal human contact, including black bears, mountain lions, elk herds, and various smaller predators. The preserve's isolation was enhanced by its location between two major wilderness areas that restricted motorized access, creating an unbroken corridor of wildland stretching over 200 miles through the Cascade Mountains. During the summer of 1982, 28-year-old Ranger Donna Pierce was assigned to staff the remote fire watch tower that provided early warning detection for the preserve's fire-prone eastern section. Donna had earned her forestry degree from Oregon State University and possessed 5 years of experience with the Forest Service, including previous assignments at Mount Hood National Forest and Deschutes National Forest that had prepared her for isolated duty stations. The assignment typically lasted from June through September, with rangers living in complete isolation except for weekly supply deliveries by helicopter and twice daily radio contact with preserve headquarters in the town of Mackenzie Bridge. Most Forest Service personnel considered the posting challenging due to its solitary nature and the psychological stress of constant fire vigilance. though Donna welcomed the opportunity to observe wildlife behavior without the interference of visitor traffic that characterized more accessible locations. The tower itself stood 80 feet above the forest canopy, constructed of steel framework with a small cabin at its summit that served as both living quarters and observation post. The structure had been built in 1963 during an expansion of the Forest Service's fire detection network and provided sweeping views across miles of unbroken forest, though its isolation meant that the nearest road access was over 6 miles away through difficult terrain that required specialized four-wheel drive vehicles during optimal conditions. The cabin contained basic furnishings, including a bed, desk, communications equipment, and meteorological instruments, along with supplies sufficient for several weeks of independent operation. A propane generator provided electrical power for essential systems, while water came from rainwater collection supplemented by weekly helicopter deliveries during dry periods. Donna's first month passed routinely as she monitored weather conditions, recorded atmospheric data, and maintained regular communication schedules with preserve headquarters. She documented several notable wildlife sightings, including a family of black bears that regularly visited a berry patch visible from the tower, elk herds that moved through clearings during early morning hours, and a pair of mountain lions that had established territory near the tower's base. Her daily reports noted normal forest conditions with no unusual animal behavior, signs of human intrusion into restricted areas, or fire danger indicators that would require increased vigilance. The routine provided welcome predictability after her previous assignment at a heavily visited recreation area, where ranger duties had focused primarily on visitor management rather than conservation work. The preserve's character changed dramatically during late July, when an unusual high-pressure system combined with atmospheric conditions to create persistent fog banks that lingered in the valleys between ridgelines. The meteorological phenomenon reduced visibility to mere yards in many areas and seemed to muffle sound in ways that disoriented both wildlife and the few hikers who ventured into the backcountry with proper permits. Local weather stations recorded temperature inversions that trapped moisture near ground level while allowing clear conditions at higher elevations, creating an eerie landscape where Donna could observe fog-shrouded valleys from her elevated position while experiencing bright sunshine. The conditions persisted for over 2 weeks, longer than any similar weather pattern in the preserve's recorded history. On the evening of July 28th, Donna heard high-pitched wailing sounds echoing through the fog-shrouded forest below her tower. The calls seemed to originate from multiple locations simultaneously, creating an eerie chorus that she initially attributed to coyotes or possibly injured deer trapped in the dense fog that made navigation extremely difficult for forest animals. However, the vocalizations continued for over 2 hours and displayed tonal qualities that did not match any animal species she recognized from her wildlife biology training or field experience. The sounds seemed to follow patterns suggesting communication between multiple individuals, with calls and responses that indicated coordination rather than random vocalizations typical of distressed animals. Tim Hardy, a fellow ranger stationed at the preserve's western entrance, radioed to report that he was also hearing unusual sounds in Donna's sector and would be hiking to her tower to collaborate on identifying their source. Tim had worked for the Forest Service for 15 years and was considered the preserve's most experienced wildlife specialist, making his input valuable for determining appropriate response measures and whether the situation required additional investigation by wildlife biologists. Tim's planned route would take him along abandoned logging roads for the first 3 miles before connecting to foot trails that led to the tower's base. The journey typically required 4 to 5 hours of steady hiking through terrain that was challenging but well within Tim's capabilities, and he carried emergency equipment, including a 2-way radio, first aid supplies, and sufficient food and water for an overnight stay if weather conditions prevented his return. Tim never arrived at the tower despite having adequate time to complete the 6-mile hike before nightfall, and he failed to respond to radio calls that Donna began making every 30 minutes after his estimated arrival time passed. When he remained silent through the night and failed to report for his scheduled morning communication check, Donna contacted Preserve headquarters to request a search and rescue operation. She remained at her post to coordinate communications while emergency response teams began searching for the missing ranger, providing detailed information about Tim's planned route and the weather conditions that might have affected his progress. Search crews included both ground teams and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging equipment that could detect body heat signatures through the forest canopy. Search crews found Tim's equipment scattered along an abandoned logging road approximately 2 miles from the tower, distributed over an area that extended nearly 100 yards through dense forest on both sides of the trail. His boots were discovered first, followed by fragments of his uniform shirt hanging from tree branches 15 feet above the forest floor, suspended at heights that suggested extraordinary force had been required to place them there. His two-way radio was located another 100 yards down the trail, its metal casing bent and twisted as if subjected to enormous pressure that exceeded the capabilities of any known animal in the region. The radio's internal components had been completely destroyed, though investigators could not determine whether the damage occurred during an attack or resulted from the device being thrown or dropped from a significant height. The search area showed signs of a violent struggle that had disturbed vegetation and soil over a radius of nearly 50 yards. Broken tree branches indicated that something large had moved through the forest with considerable force, snapping limbs that would have required tremendous strength to break. The damage pattern suggested pursuit and capture, rather than a random encounter between Tim and whatever had attacked him. Investigators found tracks in the soft earth that appeared human-like, but measured over 17 inches in length, with clearly defined toe impressions, and a stride length that exceeded normal human capabilities by significant margins. The footprints were pressed deeply into the ground, indicating the creature responsible possessed substantial weight and moved with purposeful determination rather than the random wandering typical of most forest animals. Most disturbing was the discovery of deep claw marks embedded in several large pine trees along the trail where Tim's equipment had been scattered. The gouges extended from ground level to heights of 12 feet, suggesting a creature with extraordinary reach and powerful claws capable of penetrating thick bark and scoring the hardwood beneath. The marks appeared fresh, with sap still bleeding from the damaged wood, and no evidence of weathering or insect activity that would indicate older damage. Forest Service pathologists who examined the claw marks determined they were inconsistent with any known predator species in Oregon, including mountain lions, whose claws would have created narrower marks at much lower heights. The spacing between individual claw marks suggested digits of unusual length and strength, while the depth of penetration indicated force levels far exceeding those produced by bears or other large mammals. Donna filed her official incident report describing the events as an animal attack of undetermined origin. She later told family members that she had heard heavy movement in the forest that night, but could not confirm what caused it. She avoided speculation in follow-up interviews and acknowledged that many of the incident's details remained unexplained based on the evidence recovered. Forest Service administrators attributed Tim's disappearance to a cougar attack, noting that large cats occasionally displayed aggressive behavior during extreme weather conditions, or when protecting territory from perceived threats. However, veteran rangers privately questioned this explanation, pointing out that cougars typically did not leave such extensive physical evidence or scatter their prey over such wide areas without consuming at least portions of their victims. Tim's body was never recovered despite continued search efforts that extended through the following spring, when snowmelt and improved weather conditions allowed access to previously inaccessible terrain. The investigation remained officially active for 2 years before being transferred to cold case status, though family members continued privately funded search efforts for over a decade. While some staff members had circulated informal stories of unusual wildlife over the years, there was no physical proof or official documentation to support these anecdotes. These accounts had been dismissed as misidentified bear sightings or stress-related hallucinations common among personnel working in isolation. Park records reflect only confirmed animal activity, with no conclusive evidence linking older reports to Tim's disappearance.